History buried kingdoms, yet it could never silence the rulers who once held the world in their hands. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. Sadako Kujō was born in 1884 into the Kujō family, one of the 5 regent houses that had long occupied the highest strata of Japan's aristocracy. Her lineage traced back to the Fujiwara clan, a name that once governed emperors from behind bamboo screens. But by the late 19th century, those screens had been replaced with iron railways, telegraphs, and Western-style uniforms. The Meiji Restoration had broken the centuries-old separation of court and governance, pulling the emperor from behind sacred veils into the machinery of statecraft. Into this transformed world, Sadako was born not into obscurity, but into ceremonial weight. Her family, though not politically dominant in the Meiji order, still carried the symbolic capital of old courtly legitimacy. She was educated in the customs of court life, the rituals of Shinto observance, the stillness expected of women who existed to serve the throne, not shape it. She learned how to bow, how to remain silent, how to pass unnoticed in a room full of eyes. No one trained her in how to survive the shifting balance between ritual and power. That knowledge was not written. In 1900, at the age of 15, she was selected to marry Crown Prince Yoshihito, the heir to the newly resurgent Imperial House. The decision was not hers. It was a political arrangement designed to preserve harmony between the modernizing monarchy and the aristocratic remnants of the old order. Yoshihito, son of Emperor Meiji, had suffered from serious illnesses since infancy, including meningitis, which left lingering effects on his physical coordination and, increasingly, his mental capacity. The marriage was not about companionship or even appearance. It was about optics. A healthy daughter of a noble line, uncontroversial in name and demeanor, would anchor the public image of a stable succession. Sadako was absorbed into the imperial household, which had begun to mirror a strange combination of Western-style monarchy and older Japanese rituals. She now moved through wider halls but spoke even less. Her presence became part of the national image, quiet, proper, unyielding. The imperial household into which she married was unlike anything Japan had ever seen. Emperor Meiji had modernized the throne with calculated speed. Military uniforms replaced layered robes. Imperial processions moved through newly paved streets, and photographs replaced painted scrolls. But at its core, the institution remained caught between identities. It was divine but humanized, traditional but weaponized by modern bureaucracies. Sadako entered this in-between world as Crown Princess Teimei, a title that came with public exposure but limited control. Her husband, Crown Prince Yoshihito, was increasingly kept from the public eye due to his erratic behavior and fragile condition. In his place, Sadako appeared at ceremonies and charity events. She became the visible partner in a marriage where one voice was fading and the other was never permitted to speak. Over time, she developed a reputation not for brilliance or warmth, but for composure. That composure masked a kind of quiet recalibration. She understood the role she was expected to perform. She would not challenge it. But she also understood the consequences of institutional fragility. The emperor's visible decline had to be softened, delayed, disguised. She was not a politician. But she was not naive. She adapted to the rising bureaucracy of the Home Ministry. The whispered coordination between general elders and the imperial household ministries' growing control over image and access. She did not attend council meetings or draft edicts, but her presence became a kind of corrective, an image of serenity that could not be questioned. In the corridors of the palace, she became someone who saw everything and reacted to nothing. That, more than any proclamation, helped keep the imperial household from collapsing under the weight of its contradictions. When her first son, Hirohito, was born in 1901, Sadako's role shifted again. She was no longer just a consort, she was the mother of a future emperor. But that shift did not bring her more authority. It only deepened her isolation. Hirohito was removed from her care at a young age, raised in the separate and highly controlled environment of the Peers School, under the influence of tutors aligned with the military and state bureaucracy. Sadako's influence as a mother was ritualized, not personal. Her daily life became even more bound to protocol, shrines, ceremonies, observances, while the empire around her grew louder, more militant, more detached from the quiet codes of the court. By the time Yoshihito ascended the throne as Emperor Taishō in 1912, Sadako was already functioning as a kind of guardian figure. The Meiji Emperor had been a towering presence, mythologized as a national father. His son, her husband, was no such figure. His first appearance as emperor during the state opening of the Imperial Diet became an open concern. He struggled with speech. He exhibited impulsive behavior. The bureaucracy moved quickly to control access, limit his exposure, and eventually transfer more responsibility to other arms of government. In that environment, Sadako stood almost still. Never political, never public in opinion, but always present in the precise rituals that made the imperial household appear whole. The court she had married into was not a static relic. It was a vessel trying to carry old beliefs across the currents of modernity. And she, who had once been a girl trained only to bow and recede, was now part of the architecture, keeping it from breaking apart. When Crown Prince Yoshihito ascended the throne in 1912 as Emperor Taishō, the transition was wrapped in ritual dignity, but beneath the ceremony, the reality was strained. His physical and mental decline had become increasingly visible in the preceding years. He struggled to read aloud during imperial events. His speech was slurred. His gestures were erratic. By the time he took the throne, his condition had worsened to the point that the Ministry of the Imperial Household carefully controlled his public appearances. The image of a healthy divine emperor, carefully constructed during the Meiji era, could not survive the truth. His handlers shortened speeches, limited interactions, and choreographed events with painful precision. Behind closed doors, Yoshihito's unpredictability and retreat from decision-making left a hollow space where leadership was supposed to stand. That space became the quiet stage on which Empress Teimei remained still, visible but restrained, shaping nothing yet touching everything. The Taisho era had barely begun when the government realized it could not rely on the emperor for continuity or command. Japan was no longer a feudal state. It was a constitutional monarchy, a rising imperial power with interests in Manchuria, Korea, and beyond. Political life was shifting toward elected cabinets and parliamentary debates. Yet the emperor still held symbolic and legal supremacy under the Meiji Constitution. This contradiction deepened when it became clear that Yoshihito could not deliver the annual imperial speech without incident. The famous account of him rolling up a speech into a telescope and peering through it during the opening of the Imperial Diet in 1913 became a quiet scandal within elite circles. It was never officially acknowledged, and it never appeared in public reports. But the episode hardened the resolve of the Genro, the elder statesmen, and the imperial household ministry to limit the emperor's exposure further. Public duties were minimized. Aides began issuing statements in his name, and when appearances were unavoidable, they were brief and tightly managed. Within the palace, the emperor's days grew less structured. He wandered the halls, fixated on routine, but detached from consequence. Empress Teimei observed this drift without outward emotion. She did not try to exert influence over policy or succession. She did not ask for additional roles or titles. Instead, she focused on maintaining the internal rhythm of the court. She upheld rituals, received officials in her capacity as empress, and ensured that court ceremonies moved without interruption. Her actions did not solve the problem of a silent emperor, but they softened the consequences. When foreign dignitaries visited, she appeared with poise. When charity events required imperial sponsorship, her signature carried weight. Where the emperor could no longer guide, she became the steady figure in the background, reinforcing the appearance of stability. For those inside the court, her behavior was not simply dutiful. It was essential to preserving the structure that held the monarchy together. Outside the palace, Japan was entering a period of accelerated political change. The Taisho era saw the rise of party politics and increasing public engagement with governance. The Seiyukai and other parties competed for influence in the Diet, while the military kept a firm grip on foreign and defense policy. The emperor, by constitutional design, remained the final authority. But in practice, his absence created opportunities for others. Cabinet ministers, court advisors, and general figures filled the vacuum. Still, each of their decisions had to be enacted in the emperor's name. That requirement made the illusion of his engagement indispensable. Empress Teimei, though excluded from state councils, was not excluded from consequence. Her presence at formal audiences, her visible participation in court rituals, and her steady observance of imperial duties gave legitimacy to the machinery operating behind the throne. She was not shaping policy, but she was shaping perception. The palace became a space of compartmentalization. Different officials managed different layers of the emperor's decline. His medical attendants reported to the household staff, not to the public. His physical deterioration was discussed in euphemism. The court physicians avoided direct assessments. By 1919, his condition had worsened to the point that he could no longer sit through brief ceremonies. The whispers of abdication were suppressed. Instead, the government prepared for eventual regency. But even then, the facade had to hold. Teimei's consistency made that possible. She spoke rarely. She expressed no dissatisfaction. She kept to the formal role of consort, but in that restraint, she sustained the version of the monarchy that the public needed to believe in. The emperor may have lost his voice, but the throne had not lost its shape. Not yet. When Hirohito was born in April 1901, the imperial household received the child not only as an heir but as a quiet solution to an increasingly visible problem. Crown Prince Yoshihito, already showing signs of long-term neurological damage, was a fragile link in the line of succession. His behavior remained unpredictable, and his public image required careful management. But in Hirohito, the court saw the chance to restore continuity and confidence. He was healthy, composed, and born into a system that desperately needed a next chapter. For Empress Teimei, the birth was more than ceremonial. It was a turning point. She understood that her role as consort would always be limited, but her role as mother could shape the direction of the throne. She had no illusions about the position she occupied. She had seen what fragility in the emperor could do to the institution. Her child, she decided early on, would not be weak, but she did not raise him. Like many heirs in the imperial system, Hirohito was removed from his parents early in childhood. He was placed in a separate household under the care of selected court officials and tutors. The system was designed to cultivate imperial dignity and detachment. It was meant to produce a monarch, not a son. Empress Teimei was allowed only limited contact, but even through that narrow window, she exerted pressure. She called for a strict moral education. She emphasized frugality, restraint, and spiritual discipline. She opposed indulgence and displays of personal vanity. Her vision of imperial conduct was not shaped by political theory, but by deep unease. She had watched her husband struggle under the gaze of a modern nation. She knew that her son would grow into that same gaze, but with fewer excuses. Her involvement, though indirect, often brought her into quiet conflict with the military and court advisors, who also saw the boy as a future vessel of power. The rise of the army within government structures, particularly after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, changed the nature of imperial influence. The generals and ultra-nationalist thinkers who surrounded Hirohito's education wanted a sovereign who could legitimize their expansionist visions. They emphasized strength, loyalty, and sacrifice, not moral complexity. Empress Teimei resisted this approach not through confrontation, but through persistence. She sent letters. She intervened in tutor appointments. She requested updates. Where others framed Hirohito's development in terms of the state, she framed it in terms of restraint. Her version of the throne was one of contained power, not unleashed ambition. The tension between these visions grew more apparent as Hirohito aged. His formal education placed him in contact with senior military officials, including those who viewed the emperor's role as divine authority over a destined empire. The narrative of sacred imperial destiny intensified after Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910 and during the further expansion of its presence in Manchuria. Empress Teimei observed this shift with increasing concern. She had lived through the transformation of Japan from a closed kingdom into a global power. She had seen how easily sacred language could be used to justify military control. Though she never had political power, she understood the political uses of the imperial image, and she could already see how her son, obedient, careful, impressionable, might be shaped into something she had tried to prevent. The early signs of divergence between her intentions and the state's ambitions did not lead her to resistance, but to vigilance. She remained at a distance from the decisions being made about Hirohito's upbringing, but she did not withdraw. She learned how the palace system operated. She identified which advisors could be influenced, which could not. She pushed back, not loudly, but continuously. Her interest was not in shaping a political ideology, but in avoiding the consequences of blind authority. She had experienced firsthand what happened when an emperor could not lead. She feared now what might happen when one was too easily led. As Hirohito approached adolescence, he became increasingly insulated from his mother. His life became a project managed by statesmen, military figures, and court educators. Teimei receded into the background, attending rituals, observing ceremonies, and maintaining her formal duties. But she watched closely. The boy who had once represented a fragile hope was now being prepared for something heavier. The system around him was growing sharper, more aggressive, more focused on destiny than governance. And while Teimei remained publicly composed, privately, she began to understand the limits of her influence. She had preserved the throne through her silence and discipline, but she could not control what others would place upon it. As the Taisho era progressed, the emperor's health declined past recovery. His presence at state functions became increasingly rare, and by 1919, he had ceased nearly all public duties. Within the palace, this absence created not only a symbolic void, but a procedural one. The government needed the emperor to authorize appointments, issue ceremonial approvals, and anchor legitimacy. But the emperor could not speak clearly, nor could he sustain attention during official briefings. In response, the court did not name a replacement. It adapted silently. In that silence, Empress Teimei became the unspoken center. Without seeking title or formal authority, she absorbed the role of intermediary. She was not part of the cabinet. She did not draft laws, but her presence became essential to maintaining the image of a functioning imperial court. Teimei had always followed protocol precisely, but now she used it strategically. She understood the internal rhythms of the court, when to hold audiences, how to direct access, and how to signal favor without declaring it. She did not command the chambers, but those who needed to speak to the emperor often found themselves requesting an audience with her first. Senior advisors, secretaries, and officials from the Imperial Household Ministry began coordinating directly with her staff. Her chambers, once the space of a consort, became the informal checkpoint for decisions that required imperial awareness. She listened. She asked few questions. She relayed concerns. Over time, it became understood. If Empress Teimei did not support a proposal, it would not move forward. If she approved quietly, it could proceed as if by consensus. This influence extended beyond ceremonial matters. The appointment of chamberlains, court ladies, tutors, and religious officiants increasingly reflected her preferences. She did not replace political figures, but she influenced who surrounded them. She preferred discretion, stability, and personal loyalty. She avoided individuals associated with scandal or ambition. Her ideal court was one of quiet function, not ideological fervor. As the court adjusted to the emperor's near-total withdrawal, Teimei ensured that its public face remained unchanged. Rituals continued, anniversaries were observed, foreign gifts were received. She appeared in carefully choreographed photographs that suggested unity and composure. Few outside the palace realized that the decisions behind those images had passed through her hands. Teimei's growing influence was never publicly acknowledged. The Meiji Constitution had no role for a reigning empress beyond ceremonial support. power belonged to the emperor, or in practice, to his ministers and advisors. But within the palace, staff and visiting officials began to refer to her presence not as ornamental, but stabilizing. She was a constant figure in an unstable court. She did not speak for the emperor, but she preserved his image. This preservation required more than patience. It required active negotiation. When the emperor's condition became impossible to conceal, and the question of a regency was raised, Teimei did not oppose the transition, but she made sure it was handled with restraint. In 1921, Crown Prince Hirohito was appointed regent. The decision was presented as inevitable. No mention was made of the internal pressure to act. Teimei had shaped that silence. Through these years, she rarely left the palace. Her days were structured around rituals, correspondence, and private audiences. She avoided public comment. She issued no statements, but in her absence from speech, she became a symbol of continuity. Even foreign diplomats, who had once dismissed her role, began to note her presence in dispatches. She was seen at state dinners, seated near foreign wives, composed and expressionless. She did not engage in political discussion, but she listened closely. Information passed through her, and she remembered everything. By the early 1920s, a subtle shift had taken hold. While Hirohito began stepping into public life, and the government expanded its bureaucratic reach, the palace itself remained under the quiet control of a woman who had never asked for it. Empress Teimei had mastered the rules that were written for her containment and used them to prevent collapse. She had no platform, no voice in the Diet, and no recognition in official records. But inside the palace walls, she was no longer just the emperor's wife. She was the one who kept the curtain closed and everything behind it intact. In 1921, Crown Prince Hirohito boarded a ship to Europe, the first Japanese heir to do so in the history of the imperial family. The trip was framed as an educational tour, a gesture of goodwill in the aftermath of the First World War, and a symbolic move to show that Japan's monarchy could stand among the crowned heads of the West. It was a diplomatic triumph for the government, carefully planned by the foreign ministry and supported by the military elite. But Empress Teimei opposed it. Her reasons were never stated publicly. They did not need to be. Those who understood the palace understood her silence. She knew what foreign travel meant, not just exposure to new ideas, but to new forms of power, new expectations of monarchy, and new models of rule that could be molded into something Japan's generals would not hesitate to reshape. At the time of his departure, Hirohito was 20 years old. Formally titled Crown Prince, he had already been functioning as a silent understudy. With Emperor Taishō increasingly incapacitated, Hirohito had begun taking on ceremonial duties, but his role was still carefully managed. He was not yet regent, and not yet emperor. The trip to Europe changed that. In Britain, he met King George V. In France, he walked battlefields still scarred by war. In Italy and Belgium, he was received with honor, treated not as a student, but as a future head of state. The experience, widely reported and praised in Japan, was considered a success by government officials. But to Empress Teimei, the trip created a fracture she would never fully bridge. The boy she had once tried to raise in moral discipline returned with a quiet confidence and a new set of influences she could not match. When Hirohito came home later that year, The shift was visible. He had absorbed the weight of expectation. He spoke with greater precision, held himself with stiffer posture, and responded to ceremony not with confusion, but with command. In public, he remained reserved. In private, he began to assert himself more directly. Empress Teimei did not resist this transformation. She had always known her influence would end. But she sensed that the transition was no longer between childhood and leadership. It was between restraint and utility. The military, which had observed his foreign tour with interest, began tightening its grip. Advisors with connections to the Imperial Japanese Army increased their presence around the prince. His tutors, many of whom she had once tried to steer, now took cues from defense policy and national security goals. The prince was no longer simply being educated. He was being positioned. Her interactions with him grew more formal. The private mother-son relationship, already restricted by palace convention, became increasingly distant. She addressed him with the care due to a regent. He responded with the practiced caution of someone who now had obligations beyond the family. There was no rupture, no incident. But for Empress Teimei, the shift was not emotional. It was existential. The child she had hoped would stabilize the throne was now surrounded by men who wanted to activate it. The symbolic emperor of the Meiji era had served the state by legitimizing it. The military now sought an emperor who could be used to energize it. As Hirohito prepared to assume the regency later that year, Teimei continued her formal duties without protest. But she withdrew from attempts to influence his advisors. She understood what her role had been: to preserve the illusion of imperial control when there was none. Now the danger was different. There would be control, but it would not come from within. It would be coordinated by factions that knew how to use the crown, not revere it. Her instincts, sharpened by 2 decades of palace containment, told her that the next phase would be shaped not by uncertainty, but by conviction. Hirohito was entering a system that needed him to believe in his sacred function, and the military was ready to provide the narrative. The appointment of Hirohito as regent in November 1921 marked the formal end of her ability to shape his path. The government emphasized continuity. The public celebrated. But inside the palace, Empress Teimei watched a machine she had spent years holding still begin to move again, slowly, then with purpose. And it was her son, now positioned at its center. By the end of 1921, Emperor Taishō's condition could no longer be disguised, even within the controlled space of the Imperial Court. His public appearances had ceased. His ability to read, speak, or follow the simplest ceremony had eroded past repair. The facade of participation had collapsed. There was no choice left but to transfer authority. In November, Crown Prince Hirohito was officially appointed regent, an unprecedented move in modern Japanese history. It marked a transition not only in power, but in presence. The son would now stand in for the father, not just behind closed doors, but before the nation. The ceremony was clean. The newspapers carried photographs of a composed young prince. Statements were issued in formal language. What the public did not see was the figure who remained just behind it all, still watching, but no longer standing beside the throne. Empress Teimei did not resist the appointment. She understood the necessity. Her husband's deterioration had long since crossed the threshold of institutional risk. But she also recognized the cost. The regency would push her further from influence, while giving formal power to a structure she no longer trusted. She had spent decades mastering the constraints of her role, working through ritual, through silence, through consistency. Now, with Hirohito assuming duties once relayed through her, she was no longer needed. She did not protest. She stepped back with the same precision she had stepped forward. But the withdrawal was calculated, not total. Within the palace, she retained her network. Through letters, personal attendance, and quiet exchanges with senior court figures, she remained informed. Her messages never addressed politics directly, but they conveyed preference. They signaled displeasure, and they reminded certain officials that she still understood how things worked. Teimei's influence shifted from public ceremony to symbolic positioning. She increased her presence at select religious observances and imperial rituals, maintaining visibility within the deeply traditional space of Shinto observance. In doing so, she anchored herself to the older conception of imperial responsibility, one that emphasized sacred guardianship over political ambition. While the military and bureaucratic elite pushed the monarchy toward national mobilization, Teimei's presence reminded the court of a different lineage. She no longer attended policy briefings, but her seating at ceremonies, her formal correspondence, and her continued oversight of imperial charities kept her woven into the structure. She was no longer part of the regency's machinery, but she remained close enough to see how it operated. Privately, she watched her son with distance, not disdain. His discipline impressed her. His public restraint reminded her of the values she had tried to instill. But the shape of his court, the voices that surrounded him, and the paths he did not resist, all gave her reason to worry. He was becoming a figure shaped by balance, too cautious to resist, too careful to challenge. He was steady, but not anchored. The men around him, the generals, the advisors, the ideologues, saw in him a sovereign who could validate their expansionist vision. Teimei, reading the same signs, recognized a growing pattern she could no longer alter. She saw meetings from which she was excluded. She heard of appointments made without consultation. She noted the changing tone in imperial declarations, more distant, more assertive, less cautious. Despite her formal withdrawal, she remained a presence in the daily life of the court. Attendants still reported to her. Ladies-in-waiting crossed from her quarters to the regent's palace. Ceremonial staff continued to brief her on key events. She used these channels not to disrupt, but to remain aware. Her days were quieter now, marked by ritual prayers, correspondence, and formal audiences with those who still sought her counsel. But the silence was not passive. It was practiced. She had learned long ago how to move within limits. Now, as the court's rhythm shifted around her, she moved less, but she watched more. She watched the ceremonies grow grander. She watched the military's presence harden. She watched her son, now a figurehead in his own right, step into a role she had once feared he would inherit, and she did not smile. In the years leading up to the Second World War, Japan's imperial system became increasingly entangled with the ambitions of its military elite. The emperor's authority, once ceremonial and restrained, was reinterpreted to justify rapid expansion, military aggression, and domestic control. Hirohito, now Emperor Showa, stood at the center of this transformation. Visible in photographs, present in rituals, but silent in the face of escalating violence. Empress Teimei, aging but alert, watched the shift with growing disapproval. She had once preserved the throne through careful restraint. Now she saw that same restraint being used to allow others to act in the emperor's name, without challenge. And for the first time, her silence broke. Though never granted a formal political role, Empress Teimei refused to conform to the wartime consensus that swept through the palace. She stopped attending military parades. She declined invitations to ceremonies that celebrated territorial gains. She made her absence felt not through confrontation, but through deliberate omission. Her rejection of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was not coded. It was known within the palace that she disapproved of his elevation and distrusted his methods. She viewed the rising political power of the army not as a patriotic shift, but as a desecration of the monarchy's responsibility. Her vision of the throne had been forged in crisis, shaped by containment, by the need to hold together a fragile institution without inflaming public passion. What she saw now was the opposite, an institution that allowed its image to be used for popular manipulation, legitimizing wars under the banner of divine purpose. Her disapproval became clearest during the lead-up to the Second Sino-Japanese War. As the Kwantung Army escalated violence in Manchuria and later moved into full-scale conflict with China, Teimei withheld her support. She did not attend meetings with military families. She avoided issuing ceremonial statements. Her position was not broadcast to the public, but inside the palace, it was unmistakable. In private audiences, she spoke with religious leaders and imperial officials about the spiritual cost of unrestrained warfare. She questioned the ethics of celebrating conquest as national destiny. And while she never attempted to undermine her son's authority, she made clear her belief that the monarchy had drifted away from moral responsibility. Hirohito did not confront her. He maintained a respectful distance, but he also did not change course. As emperor, he continued to issue imperial rescripts drafted by his military advisors. He did not oppose the expansion into China. He did not object to the alliance with Nazi Germany. He sanctioned the continuation of war in the name of peace. The two figures, mother and son, moved in parallel through the same palace, but along diverging paths. Teimei's gestures of resistance remained private, contained within the language of ceremony and absence. But they were understood. Her refusal to bless the war effort became a quiet point of tension within the court. For the military, she was a relic of an earlier age. For the few remaining civil advisors who remembered the Taishō years, she was a reminder of what restraint once looked like. In the final years before Pearl Harbor, Teimei's isolation deepened. The court had become more tightly controlled by the army and its aligned ministries. Rituals took on greater nationalist overtones. Even traditional observances were infused with militaristic symbolism. Teimei continued to perform the religious duties expected of an empress dowager, but she altered the focus, emphasizing purification, memorial rites, and quiet prayer. She had no platform to issue commands, but in every gesture, she refused to participate in the celebration of war. It was not politics, it was preservation. She had kept the throne from collapsing during illness and silence. Now, in the face of ambition and noise, she tried to remind it what it was supposed to protect. And still, her son said nothing. In the last decade of her life, Empress Teimei retreated almost entirely from public observation. The palace, already a space of restriction and ceremony, became even more divided. While her son's court operated on the front lines of war, approving orders, hosting military leaders, and issuing national declarations, Teimei remained in a separate wing. Few were permitted to visit. Her days followed a quiet rhythm of religious observance, health treatments, and handwritten correspondence. But it was not idleness that defined her isolation. Within that private space, she assembled something the imperial system had never intended to keep: a personal record. Letters exchanged with family members, notes sent to trusted court ladies, fragments of internal reports, and reflections penned in delicate brushstrokes. None of it was destroyed. She preserved what others in the palace might have chosen to erase. Even as Tokyo came under aerial bombardment in the later stages of the war, and as government ministries scrambled to protect or incinerate sensitive material, her archives remained untouched. She ordered nothing burned. Her attendants, trained in discretion and loyalty, followed her example. The small library of personal papers, tucked away in imperial quarters, grew in quiet defiance of a system that had always prized controlled memory. These were not public statements or policy documents. They were private artifacts, evidence of a woman who had spent her life at the center of a collapsing arc of restraint. She made no claim to authorship over national decisions, but she kept the proof that she had seen them unfold. The letters revealed no revolution. They offered no challenge to the throne or the state. What they contained instead was a steady, unspoken contradiction. For decades, Teimei had been silent in public. She had upheld ritual, obeyed boundaries, spoken only when required. But her personal notes, spare, careful, and never intended for wide eyes, suggested a clarity of awareness. She wrote of visitors who spoke too quickly, of generals who carried themselves with arrogance, of prayers said for soldiers she knew would not return. She described moments of hesitation, observed changes in her son's tone, and noted the distance that had widened between the imperial family and the people. She never accused, she never explained, she simply recorded. Her archives grew most quietly in the years after 1941, when the war with the United States began. She watched from within the palace as the empire stretched across Asia and then began to recede under the weight of Allied firepower. She refused evacuation. Even as palace staff moved sensitive records to countryside bunkers, her papers stayed with her. Air raids tore through Tokyo. Entire districts vanished in flame. Government offices destroyed incriminating files. The Ministry of War instructed units across the empire to destroy field records. But Teimei did not move. She stayed in the city. She stayed with the paper. Her decision was not explained. It did not need to be. She was preserving what the state would prefer not to remember. In the weeks after Japan's surrender, in August 1945, officials from the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers began examining imperial structures. Debates raged over whether the emperor would be tried, dethroned, or preserved. In those fragile months, the emperor's own narrative was reshaped to fit the needs of survival. The court adjusted its history. Ministers revised timelines. Testimonies were refined. But Empress Teimei made no public appearance. She held no press conference. She issued no endorsement. She remained in her wing of the palace, quietly protecting the paper record of a life lived behind the veil of obedience. Whether she saw those documents as evidence, protection, or simply memory, no one fully knew. But she had kept them, even as fire circled the city and the system that built her began to vanish beneath its own weight. Empress Teimei died on May 17, 1951, at the age of 66. The announcement came from within the imperial household, with the same formal tone that had marked all stages of her life: brief, solemn, unquestioned. There was no national mourning decree, no disruption of political routine. Her death, like her life, passed without spectacle, but it carried a weight far greater than ceremony allowed. She had lived through the transformation of Japan from a cloistered empire into a militarized power, and then into a defeated, occupied nation. The monarchy she had guarded through silence and control no longer held the authority she once worked to preserve. The emperor, her son, now reigned without command, stripped of his divinity, serving only as a constitutional figurehead beneath the scrutiny of allied administrators. Her death came not at the end of an age, but in its aftermath, when the symbols of continuity had already been emptied. Her funeral followed the traditional imperial rites. Processions moved with precise steps. Offerings were made to ancestral spirits. The ceremonial vocabulary remained intact, untouched by the political dissolution that had reshaped the government and military. Inside the palace, officials wore court robes and read texts that had not changed in centuries. But outside the gates, Japan was a different country. The Allied occupation remained in force. US military vehicles still passed through Tokyo. The Emperor Hirohito had renounced his divine status in a broadcast 5 years earlier. He was present at the funeral, formally, publicly, but his role was symbolic. The rituals of grief unfolded in a setting where their meaning no longer extended beyond the walls of the court. There were no protestations, no calls for restoration. The people did not demand her legacy be acknowledged. For most of the public, Empress Teimei had been a quiet figure in the background, rarely seen, never heard. Her resistance to the war, her private doubts, and her long shadow over court affairs were known only to those inside the palace. Her death was marked by routine media coverage, respectful but restrained. It was not a national reckoning. It was a formal punctuation on a life that had outlasted its own political vocabulary. And yet, for those who remembered the early years of the Taishō court, the quiet presence behind a weakened emperor, the woman who shaped without claiming, her absence marked the closure of something more difficult to name. She died in a palace still standing, but surrounded by institutions no longer her own. The language of rule had changed. The illusion of divine sovereignty, which she had once helped preserve through control and ritual, had been dismantled in radio broadcasts and constitutional revisions. Her son remained, but transformed. Her husband's reign, once fragile, was now historical record, and she, the woman who never sought authority, left behind no clear imprint, only a memory of presence. Nothing broke when she died, because everything had already changed. Empress Teimei left no proclamations, no manifestos, and no bold reforms in her name. She is not remembered for changing the course of history through overt action, but through the precise maintenance of its appearance. At every moment when collapse seemed possible, from her husband's incoherence to her son's complicity, she preserved the facade of stability. She upheld the rituals. She enforced silence. She held the palace together by refusing to let its seams show. It was not rule in the traditional sense, but it was something more durable than many forms of power. It was containment. In an age when institutions were crumbling, when political ambition raced ahead of legal precedent, she chose stillness as a shield. And for decades, it worked. Her influence was never printed in law or mentioned in public speeches. It passed through arrangements, deference, and omission. When the emperor could no longer function, it was she who managed access and ensured continuity. When ministers sought guidance, they came to her first. She set boundaries, not by decree, but by example. Through her composure, she taught the court how to respond without reacting, how to proceed without declaring. She did not expand the monarchy's reach, but she kept it from imploding. That was her reign, even if it was never named as one. And yet, the cost of that preservation was high. In holding the institution together, she protected it from reform. She allowed the structures that enabled later militarism to take root, unchecked and unseen. Her silence, once a shield against collapse, eventually became a void into which decisions fell without challenge. She watched as the military appropriated the sacred authority she had worked to dignify. She saw her son absorbed into a state that demanded obedience and offered none in return. She resisted, yes, but privately. She withheld her presence. She declined to participate. But she never spoke out. And when the war came, her refusal to bless it did not stop it. Her loyalty was never to the generals or the prime ministers. It was to the throne itself, the image of imperial continuity. That loyalty, once a source of restraint, became an enabler of delay. She saw what was coming. She distrusted the ambitions of the military. She feared what her son would become in their hands. But she chose not to break the institution to prevent its misuse. She kept it whole, she kept it quiet, and she let others take it where she would not. In the end, she preserved a crown that had already changed shape beneath her. She died in a Japan ruled by foreign powers, where the emperor reigned without authority, and the rituals she had sustained were now symbolic remnants. Her legacy, like her life, sits behind glass, controlled, filtered, preserved, not erased, but not fully seen. She left no declaration of purpose, only the record of a woman who stayed still while the world transformed around her. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?